Have you ever wondered what lurks beneath the surface? Like those whispers of something hidden just out of sight?
Yeah, I think we all have those moments, right, where you sense there's more to the story than what's being told.
Exactly. And today, you and I are diving deep into one of those shadowy corners of history, the late 1960s, a time of, well, massive social and political change.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. A real turning point in so many ways.
And right in the thick of it was this magazine, Ramparts. They weren't afraid to make some waves, you know what I mean?
They definitely had a reputation for pushing the boundaries, not shying away from controversy.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
And their target, the CIA.
Ah, the CIA. Always a good source of intrigue.
They came out with some pretty wild allegations connecting the CIA to all sorts of organizations, groups that, on the surface, seem to have nothing to do with each other.
Yeah, that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. We're not just relying on Rampart's claims, which, let's be honest, were pretty explosive.
Right.
We've got something really special. Internal CIA documents from 1968. They directly address these allegations head on.
It's like getting a peek behind the curtain, right?
Exactly. It's a chance to see how the CIA itself reacted to these accusations at the time.
So we're looking at this memo, indications of the scope and possible damage of new allegations by Ramparts magazine. Plus, these annexes listing all the organizations Ramparts was looking into.
Right. The memo and all those annexes, they paint a pretty complex picture.
So for everyone listening, here's our mission today. To figure out the scope and the potential damage of Ramparts' claims, but through the CIA's eyes. What did they know? How worried were they? It's like stepping back in time to this moment when a powerful intelligence agency was being challenged in the public eye.
Absolutely. And remember, we're not here to judge with the benefit of hindsight.
Nope.
We're trying to understand the CIA's perspective back in '68. It gives us a glimpse into how they dealt with scrutiny during, a pretty turbulent time.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit. How did this whole thing kick off for the CIA?
Well, according to this memo, it all started in early April 1968.
Okay.
A guy named John Frappier from Ramparts sent a letter and this list of 145 tax-exempt organizations straight to the IRS.
The IRS? Why the IRS?
Ah, that's a good question. See, by sending it to the IRS, Ramparts was trying to get their hands on these organizations' Form 990A tax returns.
Well,
Those forms, they'd have information about funding sources and spending, all publicly available. So Frappier was likely hoping to find evidence of, CIA money flowing through these seemingly independent groups.
follow the money trail. Classic investigative move.
Right. Classic.
And this letter, dated April 5th, 1968, it didn't just stay at the IRS. It ended up with the CIA's Central Cover Staff, the CCS. They got it through what they called a liaison channel. So what's that about? Why would the IRS share this with the CIA?
Well, the fact that they use a liaison channel tells you that there was communication going on between these agencies and probably some concern, too.
Makes sense.
It suggests that, the government was taking these allegations seriously enough to loop in the CIA right from the start.
So Ramparts is basically saying all 145 of these organizations are connected to the CIA, and they're trying to prove it using public tax records. Bold move.
Bold, for sure.
What did the CIA find when they looked into this list? Did Ramparts uncover some massive network of CIA influence?
Okay, so the CIA looked at the list, but here's the thing. They actually counted 144 organizations, not 145.
Oh.
Little discrepancy there. Anyway, they found that 89 of these organizations had, at some point, had some kind of CIA interest. But, and this is really important, only 2 of those were still considered operational in November '68 when they wrote this memo.
2
Yeah.
out of almost 150. That's a big difference. But what about those other 87 that had some past connection? That's still a lot.
Yeah, so the memo explains that 42 of those organizations had been mentioned in the American press around that time, and there were allegations of, direct or indirect ties to the CIA. So they weren't exactly unknown when it came to these potential CIA links.
Okay, so that's 89 with some kind of link, past or present. What about the rest of Ramparts' list?
Well, the CIA was pretty clear about the remaining 55 organizations. They said they found no evidence of any direct or indirect association with them.
So Ramparts cast a wide net, but maybe not all of their catches were keepers.
Right.
And there's this other interesting detail in the memo. It mentions 3 more organizations, ones that weren't even on Ramparts' list, but they were being secretly funded through foundations that were on the list. So Ramparts was onto something with those foundations.
Exactly. It just shows how complex these covert operations can be. Ramparts might have identified the funding source, but not necessarily the ultimate recipient of those funds.
It's like they found the money trail, but they didn't know where it ultimately led. Okay, so the memo then gets into how the CIA categorized its involvement with those 42 former project organizations that had been in the news. How did they break it down?
Well, Annex B lays it out pretty clearly. The first category is foundations and other organizations used as witting funding conduits for covert subsidies. There were 16 of these.
Witting, meaning they knew what they were doing.
Right, they were in on it. So basically, the CIA used these seemingly legitimate groups to channel money to kind of obscure the trail.
So a deliberate layer of separation.
Exactly.
What's the next category?
Okay, next we have witting legitimate foundations and organizations used exclusively to provide funding and status cover for singleton agents. 6 of those.
Singleton agents, so individuals working undercover.
That's right. So these organizations would be used to create a believable background for these agents, give them financial and professional legitimacy to make their cover more convincing.
Okay, makes sense. What else?
All right, then there's the proprietary or subsidy project organizations, also 6 of these. And this is where it gets really interesting because the memo actually names some of the code names. Cometil, Wud-Bustler, Foci-Proof.
Code names.
Yeah.
Love it.
Right.
HT Mamable, Panfish, and E-Striker.
Yeah. These sound like some serious clandestine operations, projects that were either run directly by the CIA or, heavily funded by them.
Definitely sounds like we're getting into the cloak and dagger stuff now.
Yeah.
What was the last category for those 42 organizations?
The last one was organizations that had witting operational contacts to obtain information and leads, but which were not actively involved operationally. 3 of these. So think more about intelligence gathering, networking.
Okay, so they were cooperating with the CIA, but not in the same way as those funding conduits or the actual CIA projects.
Right. More on the periphery.
So what we see here is a whole range of involvement, from groups knowingly acting as fronts, to those providing cover for agents, to actual CIA-run projects, and then finally to groups just providing intelligence.
Real spectrum.
Now, what about those organizations that weren't mentioned in the press, but were on Ramparts' list and did have some kind of CIA connection?
Well, there were 11 of these. The memo calls them unwitting organizations.
Unwitting, meaning they didn't know about the CIA's involvement.
Right. They might have received grants from CIA-funded projects or collaborated with them, but without knowing the real source of the money. They were basically caught in the CIA's web without even realizing it.
That's kind of unsettling when you think about it.
Yeah.
Now, the CIA also addresses those 55 organizations that they claimed had no ties. How sure were they about that?
They couldn't say for absolute certain, and they admit that in the memo. They say that record keeping, especially from earlier years, wasn't perfect. But their review of available files showed no signs of any operational connection to these 55 organizations.
So maybe some faint possibility of really old, minor links, but nothing substantial. Okay, so here's a question that I find really intriguing. Did Ramparts get its information from a leak within the CIA, or did they piece it together from public sources?
Ah, the million-dollar question.
What did the CIA conclude?
Well, they seemed pretty convinced that Ramparts had been working with publicly available information
Really?
and interviews with people who'd been involved in these projects.
Wow. So good old-fashioned investigative journalism.
And that's what it looks like.
But how did they come to that conclusion?
They point out that almost all of the 42 terminated but previously unexposed project organizations and 24 of those 55 organizations with no direct ties, they all had some kind of link to organizations or funding mechanisms that had already been exposed.
So it's like a trail of breadcrumbs. You just have to know where to look.
Exactly. Some breadcrumbs are out in the open, some are hidden, but a good investigator can follow the trail.
It's all about connecting the dots, right? Who's funding whom, who's working with whom.
Precisely.
The memo even mentions that some of the innocent organizations had received legitimate grants from foundations that had also given grants to exposed organizations.
Right. So it could look like there's a CIA connection when there really isn't. It's guilt by association.
I can see how that would trip up an investigation. And what are the ones where there was no apparent connection at all? How did Ramparts find those?
Well, the memo says that 31 of the innocent organizations and 3 of the previously unexposed ones had no known ties to anything that had been publicly revealed. But in a lot of these cases, the names of these organizations were similar to those that had been exposed.
Ah, so the names themselves were enough to raise suspicion.
Makes sense, right? If you're looking for connections and you see a name that rings a bell, you're going to take a closer look.
So Ramparts was doing their homework, using public clues, digging through records, and maybe making some educated guesses along the way.
That's the impression you get from the memo. The CIA even suggests that Ramparts might have been right about some organizations being connected, but for the wrong reasons. Like, their guess about why the CIA was involved might have been off the mark.
Interesting. So some accurate hits, some near misses, and some unfounded suspicions, all stemming from open sources.
That's the picture they paint.
Now, the memo ends by saying that the relevant people at headquarters had been informed and no further action was needed. That seems pretty low-key, considering the seriousness of the allegations.
Yeah, it kind of suggests that internally, at least, the CIA wasn't panicking.
Right.
They might have been worried about the bad press, but they didn't seem to think that Ramparts had exposed any really sensitive ongoing operations.
It was more about past activities, not current ones.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get into some specifics.
Yeah, let's look at some examples.
The annexes to the memo give us some real-world examples of these organizations. Annex A lists those that were still considered operational in November 1968. One of those is the African American Labor Center, Inc., the AALC. What can you tell us about that one?
So the AALC was operating under Project Core Stump, according to the memo.
Project Core Stump.
They say that a guy named Irving Brown was still the executive director and that the organization used its relationship with him as cover for operational travel in Africa and Europe.
Interesting.
They even mention these black bag payments to Brown.
Black bag payments? Sounds shady.
And they say that his activities within the AALC implied that he had operational contacts. And get this, the memo also says that the AALC had been in the news during the Ramparts period and that an article in the Saturday Evening Post had even named Brown as a CIA agent.
Wow, so this is an organization that the CIA itself considered operational, and it had already been publicly linked to them.
It makes you wonder what else was going on that wasn't publicly known.
Exactly. Okay, let's move on to Annex B. That's the one that details the 42 previously unexposed organizations that had some past CIA ties. We see the Branta Foundation, the Colt Foundation, and the Little Foundation listed there. They're categorized as witting funding conduits used for attributed covert subsidy funding. So how did these foundations work?
Basically, they were set up or used by the CIA's central cover staff to channel money for covert operations.
Right.
The Branta Foundation, for example, they used it in 1964 to make a secret grant to this Doe Fund, Inc., which wasn't exposed at the time.
Okay.
And then in 65, they used it to fund the International Development Foundation, which had already been exposed.
Gotcha.
The Colt Foundation, they used that between 1960 and 66 for secret grants to several other exposed project organizations. And the Little Foundation, that was used from 61 to 64 for similar purposes.
So these were like financial shell companies designed to hide the CIA's involvement.
Basically, yes.
Okay, Annex C lists 45 terminated cover funding conduits and project organizations. We see names like the Anderson Foundation, the Benton Foundation, and the Broad High Foundation. What were they doing?
These organizations were basically doing the same thing as those in Annex B, providing cover, channeling funds.
Okay.
But they weren't being used anymore by 68. They were, relics of past operations.
So once active players in the CIA's world, but retired by the time Ramparts started digging.
That's it.
Now, Annex D is where it gets really interesting, I think. These are the 55 organizations that the CIA claimed had no connection to them. We see names like the Avalon Foundation, the Church Foundation, the Harnisch-Fager Foundation. These sound like perfectly legitimate charitable organizations.
They do, don't they? And that's exactly what they were.
Really?
The memo is pretty clear about that. No CIA connections. So what this tells you is that sometimes legitimate grant-making can be mistaken for something more sinister, especially if you don't have all the information. These foundations might have given grants to organizations that did have CIA ties.
Right.
So Ramparts might have seen that and jumped to conclusions.
So a grant is just a grant, even if the recipient has other, less transparent funding sources. Makes sense. Finally, Annex E. This one lists 11 unwitting organizations funded by or collaborated with project organizations.
Ah, yes. The American Student Aid Fund, Inc., the Association for International Development, the Experiment in International Living.
How were these groups unwittingly involved?
Well, they either got grants from or worked with CIA-funded projects without knowing where the money was coming from.
Wow.
For example, the American Student Aid Fund, they got a cover grant from a project organization in 66. The Association for International Development, they might have gotten funds from a project organization, too. And the Experiment in International Living, they got cover grants from a proprietary organization.
So they were basically innocent bystanders. unknowingly caught up in the CIA's operations.
That's the unfortunate reality of it.
There's also a mention of the International Rescue Committee, Inc., the IRC. They're listed under Project OKUUNT.
Oh, yes, the IRC.
It says they had witting contacts with the CIA, but they turned down an offer of cover. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it shows that not every contact with the CIA led to a full-blown compromised relationship.
Interesting.
The IRC knew about the CIA, but they chose not to get too deeply involved.
So a degree of caution there.
Exactly.
Okay, so after all this, after diving deep into these documents, what are the main takeaways? It seems like Ramparts did find a number of organizations that were connected to the CIA, but they also included a lot that weren't, or that had very old, minor connections.
And the CIA's own assessment suggests that Ramparts got most of its information from public sources. They were good at connecting the dots, looking at funding patterns and shared personnel.
Good investigative work.
Right. But it doesn't seem like they had any major inside information, no big leaks.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? About the whole balance between government secrecy and a free press. How do you keep secrets in a democracy when journalists are out there digging for the truth?
It's a constant tension, for sure.
And how do you think things have changed since the 1960s? I mean, we live in a world where information spreads so quickly. Do you think it's easier or harder to keep secrets now?
That's a tough question. I mean, there's so much more information out there now.
Right.
But the tools for finding it and spreading it are so much more powerful, too.
It's a whole new game.
It is.
Something to ponder.
Yeah, something to think about.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Always a pleasure.
And keep those minds curious, folks. There's always more to uncover.